Rachel Adams adjusted her worn blue scarf one final time before stepping through the gates of Edwards Air Force Base. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac where F-22 Raptors sat like sleeping predators, their angular forms both beautiful and deadly. At 35, she looked nothing like the other recruits reporting for flight training. No buzz cut, no military bearing, just a quiet woman with kind eyes and calloused hands from years of grading papers. The other recruits barely glanced her way as she signed in at the main desk. Most were fresh from military academies or had prior service experience. Rachel had neither. Her application listed her as a high school mathematics teacher from Nevada, with a commercial pilot's license and what the reviewing board had probably considered foolish ambition. She'd kept her real credentials buried as deep as her grief. 10 years ago, Dr. Rachel Adams had been one of Lockheed Martin's most brilliant systems engineers, the architect behind the fly-by-wire controls that made the F-22 the world's most advanced fighter jet. But that life had ended the day her husband Michael died testing the very system she'd designed. The official report called it mechanical failure. Rachel called it the day her world collapsed. She'd walked away from everything. The six-figure salary, the Pentagon contracts, the cutting-edge research that had once consumed her every waking moment. For 5 years she'd hidden in a small Nevada town, teaching trigonometry to teenagers, and trying to forget the sound of metal tearing apart at 30,000 feet. But promises made at gravesides have a way of calling you home. "Mitchell! Rachel!" the desk sergeant called out, mispronouncing her maiden name despite the clear spelling on her paperwork. "You're in Barracks C, Bunk 12. Training starts at 0600. As she hefted her single duffel bag, Rachel caught sight of her reflection in the glass doors. The blue silk scarf around her wrist was Michael's last birthday gift to her, embroidered with a tiny Lockheed Martin logo in the corner that nobody ever noticed. She'd worn it every day since his funeral, a reminder of what she'd lost and what she'd promised to reclaim. The first day of orientation was brutal by design. General Harrison commanded the room like an emperor surveying his domain, his steely gaze cataloging each recruit's strengths and weaknesses within seconds. When his eyes fell on Rachel, sitting quietly in the back row with her worn notebook, his expression shifted to something between amusement and disdain. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in the Air Force, "welcome to Edwards, home of the best pilots in the world." Notice I said pilots, not dreamers, not civilians playing dress-up, pilots. His eyes lingered meaningfully on Rachel. "Some of you will wash out in the first week. Others will last longer but still fail. When it matters, a precious few will earn the right to call themselves Air Force aviators." The written examinations came first, and Rachel approached them with the methodical precision that had once made her Lockheed's youngest department head. Complex aerodynamics, flight systems, navigation theory, subjects she could have taught blindfolded. She finished each test early, double-checking her work while other recruits still struggled with basic calculations. When the scores were posted, her name sat at the top of every list. Perfect scores across the board. The other recruits glanced at the board, then at her with new interest. But not Harrison. He studied the results with the expression of a man who just tasted something unpleasant. "Academic performance," he announced during the next briefing, "is just one component of pilot training. Any bookworm can memorize formulas. Flying requires instinct, courage, and the right kind of breeding." His eyes found Rachel in the crowd. Some people are simply not cut out for military aviation, regardless of their test scores. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews, Harrison's second-in-command, nodded approvingly. A career officer who'd never quite made it to the top tier, he'd learned to survive by mirroring his superiors' opinions. When Harrison frowned at Rachel's scores, Matthews made sure his own disapproval was visible to anyone watching. The flight rotation schedules were posted weekly, determining which recruits would get precious cockpit time in training aircraft. Rachel's name appeared on every academic honor roll, but never on a flight list. When she approached Matthews about the oversight, he consulted his clipboard with theatrical concern. "Adams, right? Yes, we're still evaluating the appropriate training track for someone with your unique background." The appropriate slot never materialized. During tactical briefings, Rachel would raise her hand with questions that demonstrated deeper understanding than most instructors possessed. Harrison would look through her as if she were invisible. "Anyone else?" he'd ask, his gaze scanning past her to find a more acceptable source of inquiry. The isolation was calculated and complete. When other recruits gathered for informal study, sessions, invitations somehow never reached her. In the mess hall, conversations would pause when she approached, resuming only after she'd found a solitary table in the corner. She ate the same simple sandwich every day, reading technical manuals while surrounded by empty chairs. But Rachel wasn't entirely alone. Technical Sergeant Amanda Foster had been watching the systematic exclusion with growing discomfort. As one of the few female technicians on base, Amanda recognized the particular kind of invisibility being imposed on the quiet math teacher. She wanted to intervene, but her position as a junior non-com made direct action dangerous. Still, small acts of solidarity began to appear. A bottle of water left on the bench where Rachel studied alone in the empty hangar. Fresh batteries for her calculator appearing mysteriously in her barracks. Never any words exchanged, but Rachel's slight nods of acknowledgement spoke volumes to Amanda. What none of them knew was that every night Rachel received encrypted emails from someone deep within the Pentagon. Messages she never answered, signed only with the codename Blackbird. The same classification level as her old projects. Someone high up was watching her return, someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The messages were growing more urgent. "The corruption runs deeper than flight training. Harrison has been embezzling safety funds. We need proof. Can you access the maintenance systems?" Rachel deleted each message after reading, but they kept coming. The sender clearly understood her real identity and her unique access to systems that others couldn't even comprehend. But she wasn't ready to act. Not yet. She had a promise to keep, and revenge, she'd learned, was a dish best served with perfect precision. Late at night, when the base was quiet, Rachel would walk to the flight line and study the F-22s through the security fence. Her children, in a way, every circuit, every line of code, every redundant safety system bore her fingerprints. Harrison commanded these aircraft, but she had created them. The humiliation was building towards something. She could feel it. Harrison's behavior wasn't random cruelty. It was targeted, purposeful, designed to break her spirit before she could threaten whatever he was protecting. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd forgotten that the best engineers don't just build systems. They build fail-safes. 3 weeks into training, the whispers began. Rachel caught fragments of conversations that died abruptly when she entered rooms, saw meaningful glances exchanged between Harrison and Matthews that seemed to center on her presence. The academic perfection that should have earned respect had instead painted a target on her back. "She's not one of us," she overheard recruit Jake Thompson saying during a break. Thompson was Harrison's golden boy, square jaw, perfect posture, the kind of all-American pilot the recruitment posters featured. "Something's off about her. Nobody just walks in here from civilian life and aces every test." "Maybe she's cheating," suggested Danny Wright, another of Harrison's favorites. "I heard Matthews saying she has access to materials the rest of us." "Don't!" Rachel's grip tightened on her coffee cup. Materials they didn't have access to, like the foundational knowledge that came from designing the systems they were trying to understand. But she said nothing, just as she'd said nothing. For 3 weeks of increasingly creative humiliation. The psychological pressure was methodical and professional. During flight simulator sessions that she wasn't allowed to participate in, Rachel was assigned to observe and learn, standing in the corner like a piece of furniture while others received hands-on instruction. When she tried to take notes on the procedures, Matthews would casually position himself to block her view. "Security protocols," he'd explain with false concern. "Some information is need-to-know basis only." The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so painful. Rachel was watching recruits struggle with basic concepts she could teach blindfolded, forbidden from helping because she supposedly lacked the security clearance for systems she'd originally designed. But the real breakthrough came during a routine maintenance briefing. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez was explaining hydraulic system failures when Rachel noticed an error in the technical diagram displayed on the screen. A critical valve sequence was reversed. the kind of mistake that could cause catastrophic failure if not corrected. She raised her hand. Sergeant Rodriguez, I think there might be an error in slide 12. The room fell silent. Harrison's face darkened as he turned toward her. Ms. Adams, this briefing is for pilots and certified technicians. Unless you have relevant maintenance experience. The hydraulic bypass sequence is backwards, Rachel interrupted quietly. If someone follows that diagram during an emergency, they'll lock the system instead of resetting it. Rodriguez squinted at his screen, then pulled out his technical manual. His face went pale as he cross-referenced the information. Jesus, she's right. This could have killed someone. The correction was made immediately, but Harrison's eyes never left Rachel's face. The look he gave her was no longer dismissive. It was calculating, almost predatory. He'd realized she wasn't just another wannabe pilot. She was something much more dangerous, someone who actually understood the aircraft better than he did. After the briefing, Matthews cornered her in the hallway. How did you know about that hydraulic system? I study the manuals, Rachel replied simply. Those manuals aren't available to recruits. The technical specifications you referenced are classified maintenance documentation. Rachel met his gaze steadily. Maybe I study harder than most people assume. That night, the Blackbird emails took on new urgency. Harrison knows you're a threat now. The quarterly evaluation flights are coming up. Pentagon officials will be watching. He's planning something. Be careful. The quarterly evaluation flights were the stuff of legend at Edwards. High-ranking officials from Washington would observe the best recruits demonstrate their skills in actual aircraft. It was the kind of opportunity that could fast-track a career, opening doors to the elite, fighter pilot programs that every recruit dreamed of joining. Rachel's name predictably didn't appear on the preliminary selection list. We need our absolute best foot forward, Harrison announced to the assembled recruits. This isn't amateur hour. Pentagon officials will be evaluating not just individual performance, but the overall quality of our training program. His eyes found Rachel in the crowd. Every selection has been made based on demonstrated excellence in all areas of training. The chosen recruits, Thompson, Wright, and 2 others, spent the following week in intensive preparation. They ran endless simulations, memorized emergency procedures, and received personalized coaching from Harrison himself. Rachel watched. From the sidelines, officially there to observe and learn, but increasingly aware that she was witnessing something much more significant than routine training. During her late-night monitoring of base communications, a skill that came naturally to someone who designed many of the security protocols, Rachel discovered something troubling. Thompson's recent medical evaluations showed irregularities in his oxygen absorption rates, subtle anomalies that everyone else had missed but which could prove fatal at high altitude. She submitted an anonymous medical concern through the base's safety reporting system, carefully documenting the potential danger. The report should have triggered an immediate medical review, but when she checked the system the next day, her submission had been deleted without review. Someone was actively suppressing safety information that could save a pilot's life. Amanda Foster had been watching the systematic targeting with growing alarm. As a maintenance technician, she had access to aircraft systems and communication, logs that painted a disturbing picture. Harrison wasn't just discriminating against Rachel, he was actively undermining safety protocols that she had tried to enforce. Something's wrong here, Amanda confided to Master Sergeant Williams, one of the few senior NCOs who hadn't completely bought into Harrison's leadership style. That teacher woman keeps flagging legitimate safety concerns, and they keep getting buried. Williams frowned. What kind of safety concerns? Technical stuff that's way above recruit level. She spotted that hydraulic diagram error. She flagged Thompson's medical irregularities, and yesterday she submitted a maintenance report about engine vibration frequencies that our best technicians missed. Amanda pulled out her tablet showing logged communications. Look at this. Every one of her reports has been deleted or ignored. That's not just discrimination, Williams realized. That's criminal negligence. But they were enlisted personnel challenging officers. Direct confrontation would end their careers without changing anything. They needed proof, and they needed someone with enough rank to act on it. Meanwhile, Rachel had made her own disturbing discovery. Late one night, while reviewing publicly available flight records, she'd noticed patterns in the base's financial expenditures that didn't match operational requirements. Millions of dollars allocated for safety upgrades and training programs seemed to have disappeared into administrative overhead accounts. The Blackbird emails suddenly made perfect sense. Harrison wasn't just a bigot, he was a thief. The discrimination against female recruits, the suppression of safety reports, the careful selection of evaluation pilots who wouldn't ask difficult questions, it was all designed to maintain a system of controlled corruption. And Rachel's presence, with her advanced technical knowledge and inconvenient attention to detail, threatened to expose everything. The morning of the evaluation flights dawned cold and clear. Pentagon officials arrived in a convoy of black SUVs, their presence electrifying the base with nervous energy. Rachel stood with the ground crew, officially there to observe and learn, but increasingly certain that she was about to witness something that would change everything. As Thompson suited up for his demonstration flight, Rachel caught sight of his medical chart lying unattended on a nearby table. The oxygen absorption irregularities were clearly noted, along with a recommendation for further testing that had been signed but never acted upon. Someone had known about the danger and chosen to ignore it. Thompson climbed into the cockpit of his F-22, unaware that his own blood chemistry was about to become his worst enemy. The first phase of his demonstration went perfectly. Textbook. Takeoff, flawless formation flying, precise navigation that drew appreciative nods from the Pentagon observers. Then he began the high-altitude aerobatic sequence that would showcase the F-22's unique capabilities. At 25,000 feet, where the air was thin and oxygen systems became critical, Thompson's carefully hidden medical condition finally betrayed him. His voice crackled over the radio, strained and confused. "Control, I'm feeling dizzy. Something's wrong up here." The radio went silent. In the control room, panic erupted as Thompson's F-22 began losing altitude rapidly. "Thompson, respond!" Harrison shouted into the microphone, but there was nothing except the steady beep of a transponder attached to an aircraft with an unconscious pilot. The altitude indicator spun downward like a countdown to disaster. 15,000 feet, 12,000, 10,000. Rachel watched from the observation deck, her blue scarf fluttering in the wind from the open door, knowing exactly what was happening and exactly what needed to be done. The system was about to learn what happened when you dismissed the one person who could save you. The altitude readings on the main display painted a terrifying picture. Thompson's F-22 was falling like a stone, its pilot unconscious from oxygen deprivation at 28,000 feet. In the control room, trained professionals who commanded million-dollar aircraft were paralyzed by the sudden crisis. "Oxygen system failure!" someone shouted over the chaos. "He's unconscious!" Matthews grabbed the emergency manual with shaking hands. "Can we remote pilot the aircraft?" The lead technician frantically typed commands into his console. "Negative. Systems not responding." The backup protocol appears to be corrupted. 8,000 feet. The Pentagon officials stood frozen, watching their $30 million fighter jet plummet toward the Nevada desert with one of the Air Force's most promising young pilots trapped inside. Harrison's face had turned ashen as he realized that his golden boy was about to become a crater in the desert floor. "Ideas! Anyone!" Harrison shouted, his carefully maintained authority cracking under pressure. 6,000 feet from the observation deck, Rachel watched the crisis unfold with the cold calculation of an engineer analyzing a system failure. She'd known this would happen. The suppressed medical reports, the ignored safety warnings, the deliberate oversight that prioritized politics over pilot safety. Thompson was dying because Harrison had chosen corruption over competence. $4,000. Feet. Rachel quietly entered the control room, her worn notebook tucked under her arm. The blue scarf around her wrist caught the light as she approached the main console. "I can access the maintenance channel," she said quietly. Harrison spun around, his face flushing red with fury and desperation. "Get out! This is no time for civilians playing." "I designed the backup system for this aircraft," Rachel interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that cut through the panic like a blade. 3,000 feet. Without waiting for permission, Rachel pushed past the stunned controllers to the main console. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision, entering code sequences that appeared as incomprehensible streams of data on the surrounding screens. "Accessing maintenance backdoor," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "Bypassing primary protocols. Establishing manual override through secondary channels." Amanda Foster stepped forward from her position at the maintenance station, understanding dawning on her face. That's not in any manual. Only someone who built the system would know that pathway." 2,000 feet. Rachel slipped on a headset with the fluid motion of someone who'd done it thousands of times before. "Lieutenant Thompson, if you can hear me, don't touch anything. I've got your aircraft." As her fingers danced across the virtual controls on the touchscreen, Matthews noticed something that made his blood run cold. The malfunction wasn't random. Someone had tampered with Thompson's oxygen system. The evidence was right there in the diagnostic code that Rachel was bypassing, a signature pattern that spoke of deliberate sabotage. But Rachel said nothing about what she was seeing, focused entirely on the immediate crisis. Her priority was bringing Thompson home alive. The investigation could come later, 1,500 feet. The room held its collective breath as Sarah's commands began to take effect. The F-22's descent started to slow, but warning lights were still flashing across every monitor. Left engine fire, hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical systems failing in cascade. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, and suddenly she wasn't in the control room anymore. She was inside the aircraft, feeling every rivet, every wire, every system that she had lovingly designed during late nights at Lockheed Martin when the future had seemed bright and her husband had still been alive. "Shutting down left engine," she announced calmly, her fingers executing commands that bypassed 3 different safety interlocks. Transferring all power to starboard, adjusting aileron compensation for single-engine flight. Harrison stared at her in disbelief. "That's impossible. You can't land an F-22 on one engine with compromised hydraulics. The manual says—" "I wrote the manual," Rachel replied without looking up from her controls. 1,000 feet. The desert floor rushed up on the monitor as Rachel made micro-adjustments that no training program covered, techniques that only someone who understood the aircraft's deepest secrets could know. The F-22 was responding to her commands like a living creature, trusting her guidance even as multiple systems continued to fail. "Landing gear," she whispered, hitting a sequence of commands that manually deployed the wheels despite hydraulic failure. The gear extended partially. 60%, maybe 70%, it would have to be enough. Harrison and Matthews watched in stunned silence as this quiet math teacher, this nobody they'd dismissed and humiliated for 3 weeks, performed engineering miracles in real time. Every command she entered was precisely calibrated, every decision made with the kind of intuitive understanding that came from having designed every component personally. 500 feet. The runway appeared on the monitor, and Rachel's hands moved in a final flurry of adjustments. Weight distribution, approach angle, wind compensation, calculations that would have taken a computer several seconds were happening instantly, in her head. The F-22 touched down hard, its partially deployed landing gear screaming against the asphalt as the aircraft skidded sideways. Rachel's remote commands fought to maintain control as the $30 million fighter jet slid down the runway like a wounded bird, sparks flying from the stressed metal. For what seemed like an eternity, the outcome remained uncertain. Then, gradually, the aircraft began to respond to Rachel's guidance. The sideways skid straightened out, the speed decreased, and finally, just short of the runway's end, the F-22 came to a stop. Silence filled the control room like a held breath. Then Thompson's voice crackled through the radio, weak but gloriously alive. "Control, I'm okay! What just happened?" The room erupted. Technicians hugged each other. The Pentagon officials were already on their phones, and Amanda Foster allowed herself the first genuine smile she'd shown since Rachel had arrived at Edwards. But Harrison stood frozen, staring at the woman who had just saved his career by saving his pilot. Rachel removed the headset and turned around slowly. For the first time since arriving at Edwards, she met Harrison's eyes directly. Her own gaze was steady, professional, and completely without warmth. "Dr. Rachel Adams," she said quietly, "former lead systems engineer, Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. designer of the F-22 Raptor fly-by-wire system, Block 3.2. The blue scarf on her wrist caught the light, and Matthews noticed the small Lockheed Martin logo embroidered in the corner for the first time. Colonel Blake, who had been watching from the corner of the room, stepped forward with recognition dawning on his face. The R. Adams who disappeared after the 2015 test flight accident. Rachel's composure cracked slightly, just for a moment. "My husband was the test pilot," she said simply. "He died flying the system I designed. I thought I could never face another aircraft, but I made him a promise." One of the Pentagon officials, a general Rachel recognized from her Lockheed days, spoke quietly. "We were told Dr. Adams had left the industry permanently." "I had," Rachel replied. "I've been teaching high school mathematics in Nevada for 5 years, but Michael always said I'd fly higher than him one day. It took me this long to try." Harrison's mouth opened and closed without sound. The man who had dismissed her, ridiculed her, and refused to see her worth now understood the magnitude of his blindness. But Rachel wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the monitor showing Thompson being helped from the cockpit, alive because of her intervention. What she didn't say, what she kept locked away with her grief, was what she'd seen in the diagnostic codes. The oxygen system hadn't just failed, it had been sabotaged. Someone had tried to kill Thompson, and she had a very good idea who was responsible. The corruption went deeper than flight training, just like the Blackbird emails had warned. Harrison had been covering embezzlement with discrimination, and when that wasn't enough, he'd been willing to commit murder to protect his secret. But now Rachel had the proof she needed. Thompson's near-death experience had exposed the tampering, and the financial irregularities she'd been tracking were about to make perfect, devastating sense. The system had tried to break her, but she was about to break it right back. The aftermath of Thompson's near-fatal flight unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of military bureaucracy and damage control. Within hours, Edwards Air Force Base was swarming with investigators from multiple agencies: Air Force Office of Special Investigations, Pentagon Internal Affairs, and civilian contractors from the Defense Department's Fraud Division. Rachel found herself at the center of a hurricane she'd accidentally unleashed. The Pentagon officials who'd witnessed her miraculous save weren't just impressed. They were deeply troubled. How had a math teacher from Nevada possessed the classified knowledge necessary to perform those maneuvers? More importantly, how had the Air Force's premier training facility nearly lost a pilot and aircraft to what appeared to be systematic negligence? Dr. Adams, General Patricia Walsh from Pentagon Internal Affairs, sat across from Rachel in a sterile conference room. "Your personnel file makes for interesting reading. High school teacher for 5 years, before that a 3-year gap in employment history, and before that," she paused meaningfully, "one of the most classified engineering positions in the defense industry." Rachel remained composed, her hands folded on the table. "I've never lied about my background, General. I simply didn't advertise it. Why return to aviation after so long away?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Rachel touched the blue scarf around her wrist unconsciously. Some promises take time to keep. Meanwhile, the technical investigation into Thompson's aircraft was revealing disturbing evidence. Master Sergeant Williams, working under the direct authority of the Pentagon investigators, had discovered sophisticated tampering in the oxygen system's control software, modifications that wouldn't be detected during routine maintenance, but would cause catastrophic failure under specific high-altitude conditions. "This wasn't an accident," Williams reported to General Walsh during a private briefing. "Someone with advanced knowledge of these systems deliberately created a failure point, and according to the maintenance logs, only 3 people had access to this aircraft's systems in the past month: myself, Technical Sergeant Foster, and—" he consulted his tablet. "General Harrison himself." The financial investigation was proceeding on a parallel track, led by Defense Criminal Investigative Service agents who specialized in military procurement fraud. The Blackbird emails had been correct. Millions of dollars allocated for safety. Upgrades and training programs had been systematically diverted into accounts controlled by Harrison and Matthews. Agent Patricia Cruz, a former Air Force investigator who'd spent 15 years tracking military corruption, laid out the scope of the conspiracy during a classified briefing. "We're looking at approximately $8 million in fraudulent," Contracts over the past 3 years, safety equipment that was never purchased, training programs that existed only on paper, maintenance upgrades that were never performed. And the discrimination against female recruits? General Walsh asked. A deliberate strategy to reduce scrutiny by creating a hostile environment that drove away qualified candidates, particularly those with technical backgrounds who might notice discrepancies. Harrison maintained operational security for his embezzlement scheme. Cruz pulled up a series of personnel files on her laptop. Look at this pattern. Over the past 3 years, 17 female recruits with advanced technical degrees have either been dismissed or voluntarily withdrawn from the program. All had the qualifications to spot the kind of irregularities that Dr. Adams noticed immediately. The most damning evidence was hiding in plain sight: Thompson's medical records. Rachel's anonymous safety report about his oxygen absorption irregularities hadn't just been ignored, it had been deliberately suppressed because acting on it would have delayed the evaluation flights that were crucial to Harrison's timeline. He needed the Pentagon officials to see a successful demonstration, Agent Cruz explained. Any delays or safety concerns would have triggered the kind of detailed review that would expose the financial irregularities. So he gambled with Thompson's life rather than risk exposure. But Harrison wasn't going down without a fight. Recognizing that his position was becoming untenable, he began implementing a desperate damage control strategy. If he couldn't hide the corruption, he'd try to shift the blame. During his first interview with investigators, Harrison painted Rachel as a potential security threat whose presence at Edwards had been suspicious from the beginning. She shows up out of nowhere with classified knowledge and starts undermining established procedures, he told Agent Cruz. For all we know, she could be working for foreign intelligence services. The timing of her arrival, right before these accidents start happening, it's too convenient. Matthews, facing his own criminal exposure, eagerly supported Harrison's narrative. She had access to systems that should have been impossible for a civilian to understand. Maybe she caused the oxygen system failure to make herself look heroic. The theory was desperate and ultimately implausible, but it bought them precious time to destroy evidence and coordinate their defense. Unfortunately for them, they'd forgotten about Amanda Foster. Amanda had been quietly documenting the systematic discrimination and safety violations for weeks, initially out of professional concern, but increasingly because she suspected something criminal was happening. Her maintenance logs, personal observations, and photographic evidence of deleted safety reports painted a comprehensive picture of institutional corruption. More importantly, Amanda had been monitoring the base's computer networks in her capacity. As a systems technician, she'd noticed unusual access patterns to financial databases, unauthorized modifications to maintenance schedules, and systematic deletion of safety reports, all traceable to Harrison and Matthews's user accounts. I've been tracking digital breadcrumbs for 3 weeks, Amanda explained to Agent Cruz during a private interview. Every time Dr. Adams submitted a safety concern, it would be deleted within hours. Every time she flagged technical irregularities, the reports would disappear from the system. But I kept backup copies of everything. The evidence Amanda provided was devastating. Hundreds of documents showing a pattern of criminal negligence that stretched back years. Safety reports buried, maintenance requirements ignored, qualified personnel driven away to prevent scrutiny. Thompson's near-death experience wasn't an isolated incident, it was the inevitable result of systematic corruption that prioritized profit over pilot safety. As the investigation deepened, Rachel found herself in an unusual position. The same officials who dismissed her for weeks were now seeking her expertise to understand the full scope of the technical sabotage. Her unique combination of system design knowledge and recent exposure to the training program made her invaluable to the investigation. We need you to review every safety protocol, every maintenance procedure, every training requirement, General Walsh explained during a classified briefing. If Harrison was cutting corners to hide embezzlement, we need to know exactly where pilots and aircraft have been at risk. Rachel approached the task with the methodical precision that had once made her Lockheed's youngest department head. Working 18-hour days, she systematically reviewed 3 years of training records, maintenance logs, and safety reports. The picture that emerged was terrifying in its scope. Dozens of safety violations had been covered up. Critical maintenance had been deferred or ignored entirely. Training requirements had been waived to accelerate the program schedule and reduce costs, and female recruits with technical backgrounds, the ones most likely to notice these problems, had been systematically excluded from positions where they could raise concerns. "It's not just embezzlement," Rachel reported to the investigative team. "It's criminal negligence on a massive scale. Thompson almost died because his oxygen system wasn't properly maintained. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are aircraft in this fleet that shouldn't be flying at all." The Blackbird emails, she learned, had been coming from Colonel Janet Morrison, a Pentagon intelligence officer who'd been investigating reports of irregularities at Edwards for months. Morrison had recognized Rachel's name when she enrolled in the training program and had been hoping to recruit her as an inside source. "We knew something was wrong, but we needed someone with the technical expertise to understand the full scope," Morrison explained during a secure video conference. "Your husband's accident? We think it might have been connected to similar corruption at the test facility where he died." Rachel felt the world tilt slightly. Michael's death wasn't an accident? "We can't prove it yet, but the patterns are similar. Safety reports ignored, maintenance shortcuts, financial irregularities. The investigation is ongoing, but Harrison's network might be larger than we initially realized." The revelation hit Rachel like a physical blow. She'd spent 5 years believing that Michael had died because of her design flaws, carrying guilt that had driven her away from everything she'd loved. If he'd actually been murdered to cover up corruption. That night, alone in her quarters, Rachel sat staring at the blue scarf that had carried her through 5 years of grief, Michael's last gift, embroidered with the logo of a company that might have facilitated his death. The promise she'd made at his graveside suddenly took on new meaning. She wasn't just reclaiming her career. She was seeking justice for the man who'd died flying her aircraft and for all the pilots who'd been put at risk by the corruption she was about to expose. Harrison and Matthews thought they were fighting for their freedom, but they were actually fighting for their lives against someone who'd just learned that her grief had been based on a lie. The real war was about to begin. The investigation reached a tipping point when Rachel discovered the smoking gun hidden deep within the base's maintenance databases. Working through the night in a secure conference room surrounded by boxes of evidence, she'd been cross-referencing financial records with actual maintenance performed when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Thompson's oxygen system hadn't just been neglected. It had been deliberately compromised using techniques that required intimate knowledge of the aircraft's design specifications. Someone had modified the software protocols in a way that would cause catastrophic failure only under the specific high-altitude conditions of the evaluation flight. "This is attempted murder," she told Agent Cruz during an emergency briefing at dawn. "Look at these modification timestamps. The oxygen system was sabotaged 3 days before the evaluation flight, during a maintenance window when Harrison personally supervised the work." Cruz studied the technical evidence with the grim expression of someone who'd seen too much corruption in her career. "Can you prove Harrison did this personally?" The access logs show his authorization codes were used to make these modifications at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. Normal maintenance staff weren't on duty. Either he did it himself or he supervised someone else doing it. Rachel pulled up another screen. But there's more. This same modification technique was used on 5 other aircraft over the past 18 months. 5 other aircraft? General Walsh had entered the room without announcement, her face pale with implications. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that Thompson wasn't the first pilot Harrison tried to kill," Rachel replied grimly. "I found maintenance records for 4 other accidents that were written off as pilot error or mechanical failure, but the sabotage signatures are identical. The revelation transformed the investigation from fraud case to serial attempted murder. The Air Force's Criminal Investigation Division was immediately expanded to include agents from the FBI and Defense Criminal Investigative Service. What had started as financial irregularities was now a conspiracy that threatened the integrity of the entire fighter-pilot program. Meanwhile, Harrison was becoming increasingly desperate as he realized the scope of the evidence building against him. His attempts to paint Rachel as a security threat had backfired spectacularly. Instead of creating doubt about her loyalty, he'd only succeeded in drawing more attention to his own suspicious behavior. During his 3rd interview with investigators, Harrison's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand," he told Agent Cruz, his hands shaking slightly. "The budgets were impossible. Washington was demanding results with half the funding we needed. We had to make choices." "Choices like embezzling $8 million?" Cruz asked quietly. "Like keeping the program operational when Congress was breathing down our necks?" Harrison's voice rose dangerously. "Do you know what happens to base commanders who can't deliver results? We get reassigned to desk jobs in Alaska." But his explanation fell apart under scrutiny. The embezzled funds hadn't gone toward program operations. They'd been systematically transferred to offshore accounts controlled by Harrison and Matthews. Agent Cruz had financial records showing luxury purchases, real estate investments, and gambling debts that painted a picture of personal greed rather than institutional necessity. The breakthrough came when Amanda Foster provided investigators with her digital surveillance records. As a systems technician with administrative access, she'd been automatically logging all network activity on the base's maintenance computers. Her files contained a complete audit trail of Harrison's sabotage activities, including deleted files that showed premeditation and planning. "He wasn't just stealing money," Amanda explained during a crucial testimony session. "He was systematically targeting pilots who might expose the corruption." Thompson was selected for the evaluation flight specifically because Dr. Adams had flagged his medical issues. Harrison knew the high-altitude stress would trigger the oxygen system failure he'd programmed. The most damning evidence was a deleted email thread between Harrison and Matthews discussing permanent solutions to the Adams problem. The messages, recovered from backup servers, showed that they'd planned to use Thompson's death as justification for dismissing Rachel from the program as a disruptive influence whose safety concerns had distracted from proper training protocols. They were going to blame her for Thompson's death, Agent Cruz told General Walsh, kill one pilot to get rid of a witness, then use the tragedy to justify removing the person who could expose their crimes. As word of the investigation spread through Edwards, the carefully maintained culture of silence began to crack. Junior officers who'd witnessed irregularities but been afraid to speak up started coming forward with additional evidence. Female recruits who'd been driven from the program provided testimony about systematic discrimination designed to eliminate technical oversight. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the maintenance chief who'd made the hydraulic diagram error that Rachel corrected, revealed under questioning that Harrison had been pressuring maintenance staff to cut corners and ignore safety protocols for months. "He told us the Pentagon was watching our budget efficiency ratings," Rodriguez testified. "Any maintenance that took longer than average or required expensive parts would reflect poorly on the entire base." But the most explosive revelation came from the Pentagon's own internal investigation. Colonel Morrison, the Blackbird email source, had been tracking Harrison's corruption network across multiple Air Force installations. Edwards wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a broader conspiracy involving at least 6 different bases and potentially dozens of military contractors. "We're looking at the largest military corruption scandal since the Fat Leonard affair," Morrison briefed a closed session of Pentagon officials. Harrison wasn't working alone. He was part of a network that's been systematically looting training programs and safety budgets across the Air Force fighter pilot program. The evidence against Matthews was equally devastating. As Harrison's second-in-command, he'd been actively involved in both the embezzlement and the cover-up attempts. Financial records showed he'd received regular payments from the diverted safety funds, and his personal communications revealed awareness of the pilot targeting program. In a desperate attempt to save himself, Matthews agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His confession provided the final pieces of the conspiracy puzzle, including details about how they'd identified and eliminated technical recruits who posed threats to their operation. "We kept files on every recruit with advanced technical backgrounds," Matthews admitted during a recorded interview. "Anyone with aerospace engineering experience, systems analysis training, or previous defense contractor employment was flagged for extra scrutiny. If they started asking too many questions about maintenance procedures or safety protocols, we'd find reasons to wash them out of the program." Rachel had been their worst nightmare, a recruit with intimate knowledge of the aircraft systems, who couldn't be easily intimidated or dismissed. Her perfect academic scores and obvious technical competence had made her impossible to remove through normal channels, forcing them to escalate to more desperate measures. The plan was to discredit her after Thompson died, Matthews revealed. We were going to claim that her safety concerns had caused unnecessary anxiety that distracted Thompson during the flight, paint her as a disruptive civilian who didn't understand military discipline. But Rachel's miraculous save had turned their narrative upside down. Instead of being blamed for Thompson's death, she was being credited with saving his life. Instead of being dismissed as a disruptive influence, she was being hailed as a technical expert whose warnings had been criminally ignored. The irony wasn't lost on investigators. Harrison's attempt to eliminate his most dangerous adversary had actually provided her with the platform to expose his entire criminal enterprise. As the evidence mounted, Harrison and Matthews found themselves facing federal charges that could result in life imprisonment. Conspiracy to commit murder, fraud against the United States, reckless endangerment of military personnel, and violations of federal aviation safety regulations were just the beginning of a charging document that eventually ran to 47 pages. But for Rachel, the investigation had revealed something even more significant than Harrison's corruption. The techniques used to sabotage Thompson's aircraft were identical to the modifications found in her husband's crash wreckage from 2015. Michael hadn't died because of her design flaws. He'd been murdered by the same criminal network that had just tried to kill Thompson. The guilt she'd carried for 5 years, the self-blame that had driven her away from aviation, the grief that had defined her life since Michael's death, all of it had been based on a lie perpetuated by the people who'd actually killed him. As she sat in her quarters that night, staring at the blue scarf that had carried her through years of unnecessary guilt, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced since Michael's funeral: the possibility of true justice. Harrison had tried to break her spirit to protect his secrets, but he'd actually given her the tools to destroy him completely. Tomorrow would bring formal charges, criminal trials, and the systematic dismantling of a corruption network that had put countless pilots at risk. But tonight, Rachel allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The promise she'd made at Michael's graveside was about to be fulfilled in ways she'd never imagined. The formal charges came down on a Tuesday morning with the precision of a military operation. Harrison and Matthews were arrested simultaneously at 600 hours, led away in handcuffs as the entire base watched in stunned silence. The man who had commanded Edwards Air Force Base with absolute authority was now facing federal charges that carried potential life sentences. Rachel watched from her barracks window as Harrison was escorted to a waiting FBI vehicle, his once immaculate uniform rumpled and his face ashen with the realization that his carefully constructed world was collapsing. He looked up at her window for a moment, and their eyes met across the courtyard. In his gaze, she saw not just defeat, but genuine fear, the terror of a man who'd finally realized he'd underestimated his opponent completely. The base was immediately placed under temporary command of Colonel Janet Morrison, the Pentagon intelligence officer who'd been tracking the corruption network. Her first act was to order a comprehensive safety review of every aircraft in the fleet, grounding 12 F-22s that showed evidence of tampered maintenance records. "We're starting over," Morrison announced during an all-hands assembly in the main hangar. "Every procedure, every protocol, every safety requirement is being rebuilt from the ground up. The era of corruption and criminal negligence at Edwards ends today." The investigation had exposed corruption so systematic that it reached into every aspect of base operations. Training schedules had been manipulated to hide maintenance shortcuts. Safety equipment had been listed as purchased but never delivered. Even basic supplies like oxygen masks and survival gear had been downgraded to cheaper, less reliable alternatives, while Harrison pocketed the difference. But the revelation that shattered Rachel's world came during Morrison's private briefing. About her husband's death, the 2015 crash hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of the same criminal network, executed by Harrison's predecessor at the test facility where Michael had been flying Rachel's experimental systems. "The sabotage techniques are identical," Morrison explained, showing Rachel classified files she'd never been allowed to see before. The same modification protocols, the same timing patterns, the same effort to make mechanical failure look like design flaws. "Your husband was murdered, Dr. Adams, and the blame was deliberately shifted to your engineering work to discredit any investigation." Rachel sat in stunned silence as Morrison laid out 5 years of suppressed evidence. The official accident report had been falsified, crucial telemetry data had been deleted, Even the memorial service had been manipulated to reinforce the narrative that Michael had died because of system failures rather than criminal sabotage. "Why wasn't I told?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because the corruption network reached into the Pentagon itself. We couldn't trust anyone with this information until we had enough evidence to move against the entire conspiracy." Morrison pulled out another file. "But there's something else you need to know. Your husband suspected he was being targeted. He left behind evidence." The file contained copies of Michael's personal notes, emails he'd sent to secured accounts, and even audio recordings made on his phone during the days before his death. He'd noticed the same maintenance irregularities that Rachel had spotted at Edwards, the same pattern of safety shortcuts and deliberate negligence that characterized Harrison's operation. In his final recording made the night before his fatal flight, Michael's voice was steady but concerned. "If something happens to me tomorrow, Rachel needs to know it wasn't her fault. The aircraft systems are perfect. It's the people maintaining them who are the problem. I've documented everything. Someone's been tampering with test protocols, and I think they know I've figured it out." Rachel listened to her dead husband's voice with tears streaming down her face, 5 years of guilt and self-blame finally lifting from her shoulders. Michael had died trying to expose the same corruption she'd just helped bring down. His death hadn't been meaningless. It had been the first casualty in a war against institutional corruption that was finally being won. The trials began 6 months later, with Rachel serving as the prosecution's star witness. Her technical expertise and first-hand experience with Harrison's targeting made her testimony devastating to the defense. She walked the jury through every aspect of the conspiracy, from the financial fraud to the attempted murder, explaining complex technical sabotage in terms that civilian jurors could understand. Harrison's defense team tried to paint her as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, digital forensics, witness testimony, and the physical evidence of sabotage created an unshakable case for systematic criminal conspiracy. Dr. Adams didn't seek out this confrontation, prosecutor Janet Williams told the jury during closing arguments. She came to Edwards to fulfill a promise to her murdered husband, only to discover that the same criminals who killed him were continuing their deadly work. Her courage in exposing this conspiracy has saved countless lives. The verdicts came back after less than 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Harrison received 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Matthews got 45 years. The broader network of co-conspirators at other bases received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. But the real victory came in the systematic reforms that followed. The Air Force implemented new oversight procedures, independent safety monitoring, and mandatory technical review boards that included civilian engineers. The culture of blind obedience that had enabled Harrison's corruption was replaced with requirements for technical transparency and whistleblower protection. Rachel found herself at the center of these reforms, appointed as a special advisor to the Pentagon on aviation safety and training protocols. Her unique combination of technical expertise and recent experience with institutional corruption made her invaluable to the reform effort. "We need people who understand both the technical requirements and the human factors that enable corruption," Morrison explained when offering Rachel the position. "Your experience gives you insights that no one else possesses." The appointment meant leaving her teaching job in Nevada, but Rachel was ready. She'd spent 5 years hiding from her past, but now her past was providing the foundation for a new future. The blue scarf that had carried her through grief was now a symbol of victory over the forces that had caused that grief. Amanda Foster was promoted to Master Sergeant and given command of the new Technical Oversight Division at Edwards. Her courage in documenting Harrison's crimes had been crucial to the investigation, and her dedication to safety made her perfect for ensuring the reforms were properly implemented. Thompson, the pilot whose near-death experience had exposed the conspiracy, became one of Rachel's strongest advocates within the military community. His survival and subsequent successful career served as proof that the new safety protocols were working. "Dr. Adams saved my life twice," Thompson said during a ceremony honoring the investigators who'd exposed the corruption. "Once by piloting my aircraft remotely, and again by making sure what happened to me can never happen to another pilot." The ceremony took place at Edwards, in the same hangar where Rachel had first been dismissed and humiliated, but now she stood at the podium wearing the uniform of a special advisor, decorated with commendations for her service to military aviation safety. As she looked out at the audience, investigators who'd worked the case, pilots whose lives had been saved by the reforms, technicians who now operated under new safety protocols, Rachel felt a peace she hadn't experienced since Michael's death. 5 years ago, I thought my career in aviation was over, she told the assembled crowd. I believed I was responsible for a tragedy that took the life of the person I loved most. But sometimes the darkest moments in our lives are actually preparation for our greatest victories. She touched the blue scarf at her wrist, now worn openly as a symbol of survival rather than hidden as a reminder of guilt. My husband believed that good engineering could save lives and that people in positions of trust had an obligation to protect those who depended on them. The criminals who killed him thought they could hide behind institutional authority and military discipline. They were wrong. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Rachel wasn't listening. She was looking up at the sky beyond the open hangar doors, where an F-22 was tracing lazy circles in the afternoon sun. The pilot waggled the wings in salute, and Rachel smiled for the first time in 5 years. Harrison had tried to break her spirit to protect his secrets, but he'd actually given her the strength to reclaim everything he'd tried to take away. The promise made at a graveside had been fulfilled beyond her wildest hopes. Justice, it turned out, was the best revenge of all. The federal courthouse in Las Vegas buzzed with media attention as the trial of United States versus Harrison entered its crucial third week. Rachel sat in the witness chair, her blue scarf visible at her wrist, facing the man who had systematically tried to destroy her while endangering countless lives. Harrison's defense attorney, a high-priced civilian lawyer named David Sterling, had been attacking her credibility for 2 days. His strategy was simple: paint Rachel as an unstable woman seeking revenge for her husband's death, someone who had fabricated evidence and manipulated the investigation to settle personal scores. Dr. Adams, Sterling began his cross-examination with practiced smoothness, you admit that you enrolled in the Air Force training program under false pretenses, concealing your true identity and credentials. I disclosed all required information. On my application, Rachel replied calmly, I didn't advertise my background, but I never lied about it. But you had a secret agenda, didn't you? You came to Edwards specifically to investigate General Harrison because you blamed him for your husband's death. Rachel met his gaze steadily. I came to Edwards to fulfill a promise I made to my husband. I had no knowledge of General Harrison's criminal activities until I witnessed them firsthand. Sterling pulled out a thick folder, making a show of consulting documents. Yet you expect this jury to believe that a math teacher from Nevada somehow possessed the classified technical knowledge necessary to perform the remote piloting that saved Lieutenant Thompson's life? I expect them to believe the documented evidence of my credentials and experience, Rachel replied. Every command I entered is logged in the system records. Every technical procedure I used is consistent with my background as the original designer of those systems. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Janet Williams, had prepared Rachel for this line of attack. Sterling was trying to create doubt about her technical abilities to undermine her testimony about Harrison's sabotage. If the jury believed she couldn't actually perform the rescue, they might question her ability to identify the tampering. Dr. Adams, Sterling continued, isn't it true that you've harbored a grudge against military aviation authorities since your husband's death? That you've spent 5 years planning some kind of revenge against the institution you blame for his accident? Rachel felt the familiar weight of grief, but now it was tempered by 5 years of healing and the knowledge of truth. Mr. Sterling, I spent 5 years blaming myself for my husband's death. I left aviation because I thought my engineering work had killed the man I loved. Revenge against the military was the furthest thing from my mind. I was too busy trying to live with what I believed was my own guilt. Yet you maintained classified materials from your Lockheed Martin employment, materials that you used to— Objection, Williams interrupted. Counsel is mischaracterizing the evidence. Dr. Adams possessed publicly available technical manuals and personal notes from her own work. Nothing classified was retained. Sustained, Judge Patricia Martinez ruled. "Mr. Sterling, stick to the evidence in the record." Sterling tried a different approach. "Dr. Adams, you claim my client targeted you because of your technical knowledge, but isn't it true that your academic performance and behavior made you a disruptive influence in the training program?" Rachel almost smiled. "My academic performance consisted of perfect scores on every examination. As for disruptive behavior, I submitted safety reports when I noticed dangerous conditions. If that's disruptive, then yes, I was guilty as charged." The courtroom stirred with quiet laughter, and Rachel could see several jury members nodding. Approvingly, Sterling's aggressive tactics were backfiring, making him look like he was bullying a woman who had risked her career to save lives. "Let's talk about your so-called safety reports," Sterling pressed on. "You submitted anonymous complaints about Lieutenant Thompson's medical condition. Isn't it possible that your interference actually caused the problems you claim to have? Discovered?" Now Rachel's composure shifted to something harder, more professional. "Mr. Sterling, are you suggesting that I somehow altered Lieutenant Thompson's blood chemistry to create oxygen absorption irregularities, or that I modified his medical records to show conditions that didn't exist? I'm suggesting that your presence at Edwards created a climate of suspicion and anxiety that—" "The medical evidence is objective and measurable," Rachel interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years dealing with technical facts. "Lieutenant Thompson's oxygen absorption irregularities existed before I arrived at Edwards. They were documented in his medical records and ignored by your client. My safety report simply flagged an existing condition that could have been fatal." Sterling consulted his notes, clearly struggling with technical details he didn't fully understand. "But you can't deny that you had unprecedented access to classified maintenance systems, access that a normal recruit wouldn't possess." "I had the knowledge to understand those systems because I designed them," Rachel replied matter-of-factly. "When Lieutenant Thompson's aircraft was falling out of the sky with an unconscious pilot, I used that knowledge to save his life. If that's a crime, then I'm proud to be guilty." The courtroom was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Rachel could see Harrison at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. For 3 weeks he'd been watching the systematic destruction of his defense, the revelation of evidence that painted him not just as a thief but as a would-be murderer. Sterling made one final attempt to damage her credibility. "Dr. Adams, isn't it true that you've been working with Pentagon intelligence to build a case against my client since before you arrived at Edwards? That this entire situation was a setup designed to entrap him?" Rachel paused thoughtfully before answering. "Mr. Sterling, I received emails from Pentagon intelligence during my time at Edwards. I deleted everyone without responding because I was focused on completing my training and keeping my promise to my husband. I had no contact with investigators until after Lieutenant Thompson's near-fatal flight forced me to reveal my identity." "But you knew those emails were coming from—" "I knew someone in Washington was monitoring the situation at Edwards," Rachel interrupted. "What I didn't know was that they were investigating the same criminal network that had killed my husband 5 years earlier. That revelation came later, during the investigation that your client's attempted murder of Lieutenant Thompson triggered." Williams stood for redirect examination, her questions designed to reinforce the key points that Sterling's attack had actually highlighted. "Dr. Adams, in your professional opinion as the original designer of the F-22 systems, was Lieutenant Thompson's aircraft deliberately sabotaged?" "Yes. The modifications to his oxygen system required intimate knowledge of the aircraft's design specifications and could only have been made by someone with administrative access to the maintenance computers. Could these modifications have been accidental or the result of routine maintenance errors? Absolutely not. The changes were made using specific command sequences that bypassed multiple safety interlocks. They were designed to cause catastrophic failure under the exact conditions of the evaluation flight. Dr. Adams, do you have any doubt that General Harrison was responsible for these modifications?" Rachel looked directly at Harrison for the first time during her testimony. He stared, back with the hollow eyes of a man who knew his fate was sealed. "The access logs show his authorization codes were used to make these changes at 2:17 a.m. on a date when no maintenance staff were on duty. Either he did it personally or he supervised someone else doing it. Either way, he's responsible for attempted murder." The impact on the jury was visible. Several members were staring at Harrison with expressions of disgust and disbelief. The technical evidence that Rachel had patiently explained over 3 days of testimony had built an unshakable case for deliberate, premeditated sabotage. When Rachel finally stepped down from the witness stand, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that had nothing to do with the trial itself. For 5 years, she'd carried the guilt of believing her engineering work had killed Michael. Now, in front of a packed courtroom and a national media audience, she'd publicly declared the truth. Her husband had been murdered by criminals who tried to blame their crime on her technical competence. As she walked back to her seat, Rachel caught sight of Amanda Foster and several other Edwards personnel who'd come to support her testimony. Their presence reminded her that the corruption hadn't just been about money, it had been about creating a culture where good people were afraid to speak up, where technical expertise was seen as a threat rather than an asset. That culture was ending. The trial was just the legal formality that would put the criminals in prison. The real victory had happened the day she'd saved Thompson's life and exposed Harrison's conspiracy for what it truly was. That night, alone in her hotel room, Rachel called her principal in Nevada to formally submit her resignation from teaching. Tomorrow she would begin her new career as a Pentagon safety advisor, working to ensure that what happened at Edwards could never happen again. The promise made at Michael's graveside was finally complete. She had flown higher than him, not in an aircraft, but in the courage to confront institutional corruption and win. 1 year later, Rachel stood at the podium in the main auditorium of Edwards Air Force Base, looking out at the newest class of flight training recruits. The faces before her were young, eager, and refreshingly diverse, a mix of genders, ethnicities, and backgrounds that would have been unimaginable under Harrison's regime. "A year ago," she began, her voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium, "a corrupt general stood where I'm standing now and told a room full of recruits that some people simply aren't cut out for military aviation. He was right, but not in the way he intended. Some people aren't cut out for this profession. People who put personal gain above pilot safety, who mistake discrimination for leadership, and who forget that our mission is to protect and serve, not to profit and control." The reforms that had followed Harrison's conviction were sweeping and permanent. Independent oversight boards now monitored all training programs. Technical advisory positions were filled by civilian experts who couldn't be intimidated by military hierarchy. Most importantly, a new culture of transparency and accountability had replaced the toxic environment that had enabled corruption to flourish. Rachel's role as special advisor for aviation safety had expanded beyond anything she'd originally envisioned. She now oversaw safety protocols across the entire Air Force fighter pilot program, working directly with Pentagon leadership to implement changes that would protect both pilots and taxpayers from the kind of systematic fraud that Harrison had perpetrated. The men who committed these crimes believed that institutional authority would protect them from accountability, Rachel continued, adjusting the blue scarf at her wrist that had become her signature accessory. They were wrong. In America, no one is above the law and no institution is above scrutiny. When corruption infects our military, it's not just a betrayal of public trust, it's a threat to national security itself. In the front row, Amanda Foster sat with the other senior non-commissioned officers, her master sergeant stripes gleaming in the auditorium lights. The Technical Oversight Division she now commanded had become a model for other bases, proving that proper maintenance and safety protocols actually improved efficiency rather than hindering it. Thompson, now a captain in one of the Air Force's most promising young pilots, had volunteered to speak at today's orientation session. His survival story had become part of the curriculum, a real-world example of how courage and competence could triumph over corruption and negligence. "Dr. Adams saved my life twice," Thompson told the recruits after Rachel's introduction. "Once, by remotely piloting my aircraft when I was unconscious, and again by ensuring that the safety protocols that failed me that day have been rebuilt from the ground up. Every one of you will benefit from her courage in standing up to institutional corruption. The investigation that had started with Harrison's arrest had ultimately exposed corruption at 6 different Air Force installations, resulting in 43 criminal convictions and the recovery of over $50 million in stolen funds. The money had been redirected to genuine safety improvements, new equipment, enhanced training programs, and expanded oversight that made military aviation safer for everyone. But for Rachel, the most meaningful change was personal. The guilt that had driven her away from aviation for 5 years had been replaced by a sense of purpose that went beyond individual achievement. She wasn't just designing systems anymore. She was building institutional safeguards that would protect future generations of pilots from the kind of corruption that had killed Michael. After the orientation session, Rachel walked alone to the base memorial wall, where Michael's plaque had been joined by a larger memorial honoring victims of military corruption, never forgotten, never again. The wall now served as a reminder that vigilance was the price of safety and that good people had an obligation to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing. Her phone buzzed with a text from Colonel Morrison, now General Morrison, thanks to her leadership during the corruption investigation, congressional hearing next week on military procurement reform. They want you to testify about systemic changes needed across all service branches. Interested? Rachel smiled as she typed her response. Absolutely. Time to make sure this never happens anywhere else. The work was far from over. Harrison's network had been destroyed, but the conditions that enabled such corruption, budget pressures, inadequate oversight, and cultures that discouraged whistleblowing, existed throughout the military-industrial complex. Rachel's mission had evolved from personal promise-keeping to institutional reform on a national scale. As she walked back toward the main buildings, an F-22 roared overhead, its pilot executing the kind of precise maneuvers that were only possible because the aircraft's systems were properly maintained and its safety protocols honestly implemented. The sound no longer brought grief and guilt, it brought pride in work well done and determination to do more. That evening, Rachel found herself in the same corner of the mess hall where she'd eaten alone during those difficult weeks of training, but now the table was surrounded by colleagues, pilots, technicians, investigators, and administrators who'd become part of her extended family at Edwards. To promises kept, Amanda Foster raised her coffee cup in a toast. To justice served, Thompson added. To flying higher, Rachel replied, touching the blue scarf that would always connect her to Michael, but now symbolized victory rather than loss. Later that night, alone in her quarters that had been upgraded from recruit barracks to special advisor accommodations, Rachel pulled out the worn piece of paper she still carried everywhere. Michael's handwriting was as clear as ever. You'll fly higher than me, Sarah. Promise me. She'd kept that promise in ways neither of them could have imagined. Not by piloting aircraft, but by piloting institutional change that would save countless lives. Not by pursuing personal glory, but by ensuring that competence and integrity would triumph over corruption and negligence. The next morning brought news that made the victory complete. Harrison had died in federal prison, apparently from natural causes, but actually from the stress of facing the consequences of his actions. Matthews was serving his sentence in solitary confinement, abandoned by the criminal network he'd helped build. Rachel felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only relief that their capacity to harm others had been permanently ended. Justice had been served not through revenge, but through the patient application of truth, evidence, and institutional accountability. As she prepared for another day of building safeguards against future corruption, Rachel caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was confident, purposeful, and at peace with herself in a way she hadn't been since Michael's death. The broken math teacher who'd arrived at Edwards a year ago had been transformed into a national advocate for military aviation safety. The promise whispered at a graveside had become a mission that would protect pilots for generations to come. And sometimes, late at night, when the base was quiet, Rachel could swear she heard Michael's voice on the wind, telling her how proud he was that she'd finally learned to fly higher than them all. The circle was complete. The promise was kept. The future was secure. And somewhere in the Nevada sky, the aircraft she'd helped design continued to fly safely, protected by the safeguards she'd built from the ashes of her grief and the strength of her unbreakable will to see justice done. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.